History as it happens, March 28, 2024. Too old or too young to be president.
It was Seneca or it was Cicero, I don't know which, that said, if it was not for the elders correcting the mistakes of the young, there would be no state.
Mr. Herr, based on your report, did you find that the president was senile?
Over $1.3 billion. Trump just talks the talk. We walk the walk.
And Putin, has so little respect for Obama that he's starting to throw around the nuclear word. You heard that, nuclear. He's starting to talk nuclear.
Frankly, he doesn't know what the hell he's talking about.
Our army manned the air. It ran the ramparts. It took over the airports. It did everything it had to do.
Los Angeles what am I doing here?
How old is too old to run the country? Donald Trump will turn 78 in June. Joseph Biden, 82 after the election. Age has rarely been so prominent an issue in a presidential campaign. No one can turn back the clock, but there are ways to make age an asset. That's next with Lindsay Chervinsky as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
I think the first time it's really addressed publicly and vocally is Eisenhower's re-election campaign, because he had had a heart attack during his first term. He was very open about discussing his health, and he really took a great deal of time in deciding whether or not he was actually even going to run to make sure he had fully recovered and he felt up to the job.
So have you heard? A couple of old guys are running for president. But old age seems to be hurting one more than the other, and that would be President Biden, who as of late has been embracing his age as an asset rather than having his surrogates pretend he isn't slowing down at all.
Look, I'm not a young guy. That's no secret. But here's the deal. I understand how to get things done for the American people. I led the country through the COVID crisis. Today,
Donald Trump is old too, as mentioned, 78. But maybe his age is less of a problem for him because we're paying more attention to what he says, not how he says it. Let's be straight here. Both men commit plenty of gaffes. It's not hard to find long compilations of these verbal screw-ups or memory lapses online. So, is age a legit issue? Does getting older automatically mean you're incapable of doing a demanding job, maybe the most demanding job there is? Or does temperament matter more?
Are you ready? Can I talk?
Yeah, what's
you
the
mind?
answer?
Do you mind?
I would like for you to answer the question.
Okay, it's very simple to answer.
That's why I asked it.
It's very simple to... You're a nasty person, I'll tell you.
You'll remember the special counsel Robert Hur's report on Biden and his classified documents, the president's memory lapses during his deposition, as Hur reported them, angering Democrats in Congress.
Attorney Herr, Webster's dictionary defines senile as exhibiting a decline of cognitive ability, such as memory associated with old age. Mr. Herr, based on your report, did you find that the president was senile?
I did not. That conclusion does not appear in my report, Congressman.
And when the president responded to concerns about his mental capacities after the Hur report, may have had the opposite of the intended effect.
I know there's some attention paid to some language in the report about my recollection of events. There's even reference that I don't remember when my son died. How in the hell dare he raise that? Frankly, when I was asked the question, I thought to myself, it wasn't any of their damn business. I'm well-meaning, and I'm an elderly man, and I know what the hell I'm doing. I've been president, and I put this country back on its feet. I don't need his recommendation. It's totally
How bad is your memory, and can you continue as president?
My memory is so bad, I let you speak. That's
your memory has gotten worse, Mr.
No, look,
President?
my memory is not good. My memory is fine.
If age decides the election in November, and remember, both men are old, it might be for the first time in American history. Being too old or too young has been an issue before, but I can't think of any time it was decisive in a candidate's defeat. And if anything, at the other end of the spectrum, being young and full of vigor has helped some candidates, although youth and inexperience has also been seen as a liability. Depends on who we're talking about. In 1955, President Eisenhower had a serious heart attack. It nearly killed him. And it was major news, as these British Pathé newsreels show.
President Eisenhower, after a final series of physical tests, is told by his doctors that he has made a good recovery from his heart attack.
But Ike, then in his mid-60s and who dealt with another news-making malady after his heart attack,
Stricken with ileitis and inflammation of the lower intestine, the 65-year-old chief executive was taken from the White House.
was able to demonstrate he was well enough to trounce Adlai Stevenson by 10 million popular votes the following year, 457 to 73 in the Electoral College.
First of all, the doctor tells me that what he called my vital capacity is very much improved. I don't know the meaning of the term, and so there's no use asking me about it. But I feel very much better.
Questions about age shadowed Ronald Reagan as early as the mid-1970s when he was preparing to challenge Gerald Ford for the GOP nomination. But Reagan, with his wit and charm, dealt with it. And here he is in his 1982 State of the Union address.
President Washington began this tradition in 1790 after reminding the nation that the destiny of self-government and the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty is finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. For our friends in the press who place a high premium on accuracy, let me say, I did not actually hear George Washington say that.
A more famous one-liner would follow in 1984, and we're going to talk about that and more with presidential historian Lindsay Chervinsky, author of The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution. She's also the creator of the Audible course, The Best and Worst Presidential Cabinets in U.S. History, and she has another book coming out this September. We're going to talk about that, too. Lindsay Chervinsky, welcome to the podcast. It is great to finally have you on.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
So this is your debut here. So let's begin by having you discuss your work. You are a presidential historian, and you just gave a talk at Monticello, so congratulations. That's quite an honor. That was about your most recent book about the cabinet, the creation of the cabinet under George Washington. But you've got another book coming out as well, Oxford University Press, about the John Adams presidency. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for my debut. I am a presidential historian. I have my PhD in American history, and my goal is really to try and explain the historical origins of our contemporary moment and why it matters. The most recent book is really informed by that goal, and it looks at if Washington, creates this presidency, then what happens for everyone else who's in office, because he was a relatively unique figure. And John Adams was tasked with trying to create the norms and precedents and customs that I think really serve as the scaffolding of our political system, that uphold the behaviors and the expectations that we have for political figures, most importantly being the peaceful transfer of power. And so his presidency is really dominated by those concerns, and I think have been maybe a little underappreciated because most historians, most Americans, especially in the 20th and 21st centuries, really took that process for granted until recently. And so I'm hopeful that I can demonstrate to people why this was such an important period and why his contribution is really worth remembering.
Well, the idea of having a national presidential election, there really wasn't one under Washington the same way. The election of 1796 and then the election of 1800, those are the two Adams was involved in. They were kind of figuring that out as they went, right?
That's absolutely right. Washington was the only president to be elected unanimously twice, and so there was just never a competition. And so the concept of how do you campaign? How do you put together some sort of infrastructure? How do you have different elections across all of the states? How do you count the votes? That takes a really long time and is something that's very new and fraught with a great deal of tension in 1796 and 1800. And, we know how it turned out. We know that it worked out well, that these things were fine, that the government and the great experiment survived, but they didn't really know that. And so trying to put ourselves in their shoes and really feel that tension is important.
The electorate was tiny. The actual number of people who voted was rather small. I think it was something like 30,000 in the election of 1800, if I'm getting that right.
I don't know the exact numbers, but you're right, because only white men, and in most states, only white men of a certain amount of property could vote. So women were not really permitted to vote. People of color were not permitted to vote. And so we're talking about a very small segment of the population, which meant that not only was every vote very valuable, but the way that people campaigned was much more person to person and much more hands-on than we would think of today.
Yeah, I should also mention the title of this upcoming book, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. One more thing about the book before we move on to the subject that I wanted to discuss with you here. I'm assuming you also touch on the high level of polarization and paranoia that was running through the body politic in the 1790s. It was quite crazy.
I do. There's so many things about the 1790s that, as I was writing about them, felt so shockingly familiar. So they were battling pandemics. There were these huge spikes in immigration and xenophobia. There were debates about citizenship. There were fractures within both parties, and that led to a really high degree of partisanship, to your point. The campaigns were nasty. I mean, they just lied about each other. So we think that we're in a particularly bad moment, but we have certainly been there before, and they were not nice about it in any way.
Yeah, there's nothing truly unprecedented in American politics today. Well, there might be one exception to that. We didn't have a peaceful transfer of power this last time around. But yeah, the 1790s, each side thought the other was going to destroy the republic if it won the election, that we would have no more elections. I guess that's one possible parallel to today. When was the first time age ever came up in a campaign? Do we know?
Well, I think there were always private concerns about age. So especially, I would say, in FDR's later terms, in his later campaigns, anyone who looked at him could see that he was, especially in his last campaign, was starting to look quite frail, quite sickly. And there was, I think, a general consensus among the people who knew him well that he probably wasn't going to make it for the 4 years of his final term. But when we think about age as a subject in the campaign, I think the first time it's really addressed publicly and vocally is Eisenhower's re-election campaign, because he had had a heart attack during his first term. And so he was very open about discussing his health, and he really took a great deal of time in deciding whether or not he was actually even going to run, to make sure he had fully recovered and he felt up to the job. So the transparency with which he discussed his health really brought it to the front of the conversation.
He was about 65 at the time when he suffered a major heart attack, as you say, playing golf in 1955. The election was the following year against Adlai Stevenson. So how did he handle not just the age, but the fact that he had a serious heart attack? Were they transparent about it?
Initially, in the first 24 hours, they weren't particularly transparent, but that's because he actually didn't know what had happened. So his family doctor, I'm not sure, was necessarily the best healthcare that could be provided. And so initially, the family doctor said that he had just had indigestion and was having stomach problems. But once he was able to see specialists, then it was very clear that there had been this much more traumatic health incident. And at that point, Eisenhower had authorized his medical team to release information to the public, to be quite transparent about it. And in fact, they sometimes went a little bit overboard and were, talking in excruciating detail about his bowel movements, which he didn't think was really necessary for the public to know. But, he really wanted all information to be available. And then in terms of managing the role of governing while going through this process, he continued to speak regularly with the vice president, Richard Nixon. He spoke regularly with the cabinet. He had his advisors near him. So he definitely was staying in touch with everything that was happening, but he wasn't in the meetings day to day, and demonstrated, I think, a great deal of trust for his cabinet in particular to continue to manage the administration.
And this is before the modern era of television in politics, but the presidency by this point is a very public office. Insofar, Eisenhower had no option of hiding from the press if he had really suffered lingering problems from this heart attack, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, both the press were aware of his movements, they were aware of his travels, they were aware of his intended schedule. So anytime that shifted, there was a discussion about why it was shifting. That actually gets at a broader point that's worth acknowledging, that there are two big shifts in American history that change how presidents handle health. One is the evolution of modern medicine. So I think there's an expectation now that our presidents are going to live out the term, but that is a relatively modern expectation, because in the 18th century and the 19th century, you could get a cold and it could turn to be fatal. You could have a heart attack and they didn't really know what it was. And so health, I think, just was not something that people were willing to hold against presidents or put in their favor just because it was so unpredictable, the life expectancy of people. And then the second piece, of course, is the technology that you're talking about, that the more available pictures and film and press coverage is of the president, and of course, as the job gets a lot bigger, then there does start to be this increased focus.
Then the great day arrived, the day of the President and Mrs. Eisenhower's return to Washington. And in thanking the many well-wishers for their wonderful reception, Ike proved that he hasn't lost his customary good humor.
I am happy the doctors have given me at least a parole, if not a pardon, and I expect to be back at my accustomed duties, although they say I must ease my way into them and not bulldoze my way into them.
One of the things that's so amazing about the first presidency is George Washington had two really, really severe health scares in the first 2 years of his presidency. He had basically a tumor on his leg that had to be removed without, of course, the benefit of modern medicine and surgery. And it was excruciating, and people thought that he was going to die. The history of the presidency would look very different if he had died in 1790. So even he was not immune from those concerns.
Oh, surgery without anesthesia. What a time to be alive. Back to Eisenhower and the lessons he may have learned from what happened to Woodrow Wilson in Wilson's second term. So we're talking age and health here. It's kind of related. The older you get, the more health problems you might have. Wilson had a really severe stroke in 1919. Yeah, 1919. He has a really severe stroke, and he basically hides. Who was running the country when he was incapacitated?
In addition to the lack of knowledge about healthcare, we also know that they had a lack of knowledge about what contributed to things like stroke. So, smoking and eating and lifestyle and of course stress. And he had just tried to negotiate the end of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, and the League of Nations. So he was under an enormous burden and had a series of strokes that really incapacitated him and debilitated him, and he was locked away in his bedroom. His doctors and his wife really limited who had access to him. The cabinet continued to function-ish. The vice president at the time had no interest in trying to seize power, and so the cabinet had sort of deliberated whether he should be removed because he very clearly could not manage any of the responsibilities of the presidency, and they decided not to take that action. The 25th Amendment, of course, had not yet been passed. And so there's a lot of evidence that suggests that his wife was the one managing, if not the presidency, managing who was in charge of what things and what information came to Wilson. There's evidence that suggests perhaps she was making some decisions. So it really was in some ways a little bit of a constitutional coup. I'm not totally willing to say it was a full coup, but it definitely was not what the Constitution intended.
Yeah, this was, again, in 1919. He was in his early 60s. He actually wasn't that old. This did stop him from seeking a third term. I mean, I think he wanted to run a third time. There was no ban on that at that point.
He did begin to recover a bit towards the end of his presidency, and apparently he was, a little bit delusional, thinking that he could still run for a third term, even though he was in poor health and had to be dissuaded from that notion.
He died shortly after that, a few years later. Maybe the first time in a modern campaign age becomes an issue after Eisenhower was not on the older end of the spectrum, but the younger end, right? This was Nixon and Kennedy, and Nixon made the case, right, that Kennedy was just too young and inexperienced. This is 1960.
This 1960 election is amazing because Nixon was only, I think, 4 years older than Kennedy at the time. He would have been 48 if he won in 1960 when he was inaugurated, which would have been really quite young. So it's not like he had decades of, additional time on Kennedy, but in particular, he focused his criticisms more on the inexperience. So he kind of let the youth speak for itself, but then talked about how he had so much more executive experience, so much more experience in Congress, and Kennedy just really didn't know what he was doing and allowed people to draw their own conclusions about maybe he was just too young for the job.
Kennedy's youthful appearance was a help. It helped him. I mean, here's a guy with a beautiful family. He's tall and handsome and tanned. After you had grandfatherly figures in the presidency since the early 1930s. FDR, who had polio and was in a wheelchair, and as you mentioned, he was dying when he ran for a fourth term. Then you had Truman, then you had Eisenhower. Eisenhower had the serious heart attack. Then along comes Kennedy. I mean, that's why they called it Camelot and the whole mythology around the Kennedys.
At the moment that Kennedy was running, his youth really benefited him because there had been, as you said, a lot of older candidates, but it also was a shifting point in American history. There was sort of the dawn of a new age. And so the youth seemed to coincide with a new moment in American history. It was time for a new generation to take over. And I don't know that his youth would have been quite so powerful if it had come at a moment that wasn't quite a strong turning point.
Yeah, the new frontier, right?
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century.
The first one I really remember was 1984, Reagan seeking re-election in his mid-70s. No president had been this old. The implication being when you get old, you slow down, your memory starts to go. I don't think there were any allegations that Reagan was suffering from Alzheimer's yet at this point. That comes later on. What did Walter Mondale, who wound up losing 49 states to 1 in the Electoral College, what did Mondale say about Reagan's age, and how did Reagan handle the matter?
Well, what's really interesting about this campaign is what Mondale said earlier in the campaign is often overshadowed by how Reagan handled it later. So there were a series of debates. They had 3 that year. And the one that took place earlier in October, Reagan had not done very well. He seemed tired. He seemed a little bit slow. He seemed sluggish. He was having trouble remembering some things. And Mondale really hammered him for that and hammered him for being more elderly and talking about the importance of having a new generation and young, vibrant leadership. What we tend to remember is what happened at the next debate, where Reagan was much more lively. He was his, funny, vibrant self, and he made the very famous quip that he would not hold his opponent's youth and inexperience against him.
Mr. Truitt, your question to President Reagan.
Mr. President, I want to raise an issue that I think has been lurking out there for 2 or 3 weeks and cast it specifically in national security terms. You already are the oldest president in history, and some of your staff say you were tired after your most recent encounter with Mr. Mondale. I recall yet that President Kennedy had to go for days on end with very little sleep during the Cuba Missile Crisis. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience. If I still have time, I might add, Mr. Truitt, that it was Seneca or it was Cicero, I don't know which, that said, if it was not for the elders correcting the mistakes of the young, there would be no state.
Even Mondale laughed. I mean, how do you not laugh at that sort of quip? And so I think that was really what ended that conversation.
How often has age even been the determining factor? It's been an issue at times, as we're discussing here, but I don't know. There also could be a backlash, right, about focusing too strongly on someone's age. I mean, with age comes experience and wisdom and maybe the ability to listen a little bit more. I mean, I can't remember a time where it was decisive. Maybe it'll be this year, but...
Yeah, I don't think it has been decisive at any point really in American history. This year is perhaps when it's the most front and center, and maybe that's a reflection of media or social media or the fact that both candidates are older. If a candidate harps too much on age, it does risk alienating the voters who are older, because of course we know that the older voting blocks tend to be quite reliable and they are among the most reliable voters. And so you don't want to turn off those people suggesting that anyone over a certain age limit is incapable of making a decision or incapable of thinking clearly. And so there is a fine line for candidates to walk. And I think they've generally tried to focus either on experience or bringing a fresh face to the White House.
Yeah, I mean, everyone is different. Some people are really capable when they reach their 70s. So 1988, I don't remember age being a real issue there. 1992, Clinton, Perot, Bush. I mean, I think Clinton's youth helped him there, and his vigor and his charisma were assets.
I agree. Youth tends to be an asset, especially when it comes at a point where either one party has been in power for a while, as was the case with 2 terms of Reagan and then a term of Bush, or when people are feeling like, again, it's time for a fresh change or a new generation. And so typically we tend to see candidates like Kennedy, like Carter, like Clinton that appear to be younger, appear to be a fresh face, a new perspective at a key turning point in American history. And I think that it's no accident that at other times younger candidates have not done as well because they're not capturing that same momentum behind the push for something new.
So yeah, on the youth issue, it can work against candidates. I remember Dan Quayle, who had been a successful young politician, House of Representatives, Senate, but his launch went so badly as George H.W. Bush's running mate in 1988. You know, all the public gaffes. He just came off as being, well, way out of his league. And at a debate against the vice presidential running mate for Dukakis in 88, Lloyd Benson, I think Quayle made some remark about how, you know, John Kennedy was young too, and that backfired on him, didn't it?
I have as much experience in the Congress as Jack Kennedy did when he sought the presidency.
Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.
That was really uncalled for, Senator.
Quayle never really recovered from that. But it didn't stop George Bush from winning decisively. People don't really vote for vice president. Bob Dole, 1996. He was like 72, 73 years old. I remember this election. It was the first one I could vote in. And on stage with Clinton in those debates, I mean, Clinton didn't actually have to say anything. You just saw. Dole just looked passé. I don't know. Maybe I'm being unkind.
How do you feel you can respond to the young voices of America today and tomorrow?
I can only tell you that I don't think Senator Dole is too old to be president. It's the age of his ideas that I question.
Well, the role of television in how people are depicted is really important. And in fact, the first campaign where that was noted was the Nixon Kennedy campaign, because Nixon had a very heavy 5 o'clock shadow. He kind of looked like he was caked in makeup. He looked tired. He looked run down, whereas Kennedy looked tan and vibrant, and like he understood the medium behind television. And anyone who has been on television knows that the lighting and the makeup and how you dress is very different than how you appear in day to day. And Clinton was young. He was also a brilliant debater. He was a really incredible sort of once-in-a-generation communicator with people. And while I have so much respect for Dole's service and his commitment to the United States for decades, Clinton would be hard to debate against for anybody, let alone the dynamics of that particular race.
Well, we always hear how elections are about the future, right? And Dole just looked old, sounded old. He was old. He had been around a really long time in Washington. His ideas seemed old. That's the impression you get from watching that. Speaking of older candidates on the Republican side, in 2008, John McCain faced questions about his age.
The 2008 campaign is another one of those examples where the visual contrast is so striking, and especially with the 8 years of the Bush presidency, it was another one of those turning points. And Obama, again, was one of those once-in-a-generation communicators. He represented this hope for a different future, the future of the United States, the promise of what the nation could be. And McCain was so well known because of his decades of service, because of his sacrifice on behalf of the nation. So even if he was completely up to the job, which I believe that he was going to appear to be old by contrast. And again, this is one of those moments where I don't think he even really necessarily had to say anything. But a key part of Obama's campaign was this new look at the United States, this hope for the future. And so inherently, it means drawing a distinction between an older way of doing things.
Yeah, Obama, young, attractive, tall, in good shape. McCain, older, white-haired, again, had been around a long time. And also, a lot of other things going on at this time. It was a tough year for Republicans, no matter who had won. Who would have won that nomination on the GOP side after what happened during the Bush years with the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, and then, of course, the economic crisis in 2008, 2009.
Do you take offense to Obama's comment that you're, quote, losing your bearings? And the bigger issue...
I ignore it. I don't take offense to it.
And do you feel that your age is a legitimate issue in this campaign?
Every issue that the American people want to be an issue and it's part of their discussions, it's fine with me. It's fine with me. Just as the Reverend Wright's remarks, I don't believe that Senator Obama shares his views in any way. But he has said that it's a legitimate topic of discussion. If that's what the American people want to discuss, that's fine. I'll continue to try to introduce them to my 96-year-old mother and and display the same vigor and same energy that I have been able to display throughout this campaign, which allowed me to win the nomination of my party.
I don't recall Trump's age being a big deal in 2016, although he would become the oldest president ever at inauguration. I mean, Hillary Clinton was older, on the older side as well. There were just other concerns about Trump's, as it's often said, mental fitness for office that seemed to trump his, no pun intended, his age. He was a celebrity too, so maybe the age thing just didn't really matter to people. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think that it did. I think, if anything, maybe there was a question about his physical fitness and whether or not he was healthy enough for the job. Especially, the Trump campaign made a lot of Hillary Clinton's health because she had pneumonia at one point in the campaign.
Oh, that's right. There are a lot of crazy conspiracy theories about that.
Yeah. And so then I think there was a conversation about the health of both candidates and what physical health is required for the job. I don't think his mental health was really discussed and whether or not he was mentally too old for the job. One of the things that Trump benefited from in 2016, and I think since then, is he produces so much news and so many headlines. Even if there was a discussion of age, it would be difficult for that to dominate all of the other news that comes out regularly.
Yeah, it wasn't an age thing. It was a temperament thing is what I was trying to say before. I didn't put it that well. Oh, also Clinton turned the age issue on Obama when they ran against each other in 2008 for the Democratic nomination, the so-called 3 a.m. phone call.
It's 3 a.m. and your children are safe and asleep. But there's a phone in the White House and it's ringing. Something's happening in the world. Your vote will decide who answers that call. Whether it's someone who already knows the world's leaders, knows the military, someone tested and ready to lead in a dangerous world.
I just wanted to take a little moment, since we're talking about the politics of fear. I wanted to take a moment to respond to an ad that Senator Clinton put up today. Here the ad says, "Who do you want answering the phone in the White House when it's 3 a.m. and something has happened in the world?" We've seen these ads before. They're usually the kind that play on people's fears and try to scare up votes. But it won't work, because the question is not about who's picking up the phone. The question is, what kind of judgment will the person who answers the phone have?
All right, let's talk about this year. President Biden, already the oldest president in American history. Biden was 78 in 2020 at inauguration. The median age for presidents at inauguration is 55. How do you think he is handling the age issue so far?
Initially, when it was clear that he was running again, he didn't handle it all that well. I think he wanted to avoid it. I think he thought if he just didn't discuss it, if he continued to do the job of president, then it would go away. And it was clear that that did not work. And so I think there was a real shift, perhaps starting before the State of the Union, a couple weeks before the State of the Union, up through the State of the Union, and then since then, where he's calling it out. He is acknowledging that it's a thing. He's acknowledging that he's old. He's often making a quip about it. He's making jokes. And I think it has to be handled that way, because there is no denying that this is going to be a consideration. And so if he can show that he's aware of it and he has a sense of humor about it, and especially that he can speak off the cuff, that seems to be what impresses people the most. People aren't worried about his ability to read a teleprompter. They're worried about his ability to speak in an organic fashion. So the more that he does that kind of thing, the more I think it will reassure people. And it seems that the campaign is leaning more into that.
I know it may not look like it, but I've been around a while. When you get to be my age, certain things become clearer than ever. I know the American story. Again and again, I've seen the contest between competing forces in the battle for the soul of our nation.
He doesn't seem to have any serious health matters at the moment. Yeah, I think you're right. The only way to handle this, because it's a no-win situation. Every time you make a gaffe, and he does make a lot of gaffes, he's always been that way, they're going to say, oh, it's because he's old. But the only way to handle this is to have a really vigorous public schedule, hold a lot of events, hold news conferences, do town halls on cable news. He doesn't do a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, I also think that there are other types of events that he's actually excels at even more. So if he can meet with people in a local setting, he really likes average Americans. And I'm not sure that all politicians can actually say that. He really likes interacting with them. He loves a rope line. He loves handshakes. He loves going into a diner and meeting with people. And that type of interaction and that type of coverage, I think, will be both suited to his strengths, but also really beneficial for people to see.
And on the issue of how old is too old, just a number is not enough, right, to determine this. But there are statutes. Well, we have the 25th Amendment, right? Now, everyone today thinks they are a specialist in mental health, mental acuity online. So you see things like, oh, he's senile, and Trump gets a lot of this as well. He's mentally ill. He's not mentally competent. Needs to take a mental fitness test. How do you define these things? They're just used in a political context, so they mean nothing after a while. What is the 25th Amendment, or what is the criteria, if you will, to remove somebody from the presidency?
The 25th Amendment was designed for two separate reasons. One, there's an acknowledgement that in modern life, sometimes the president needs to have a procedure, whether it's a planned or unexpected surgery, where they are not going to be able to be in control of the government for a relatively short period of time. And we want presidents to be responsible in those moments and temporarily hand over authority such that if there is an emergency and it does require immediate action, there is a clear chain of command and there are no constitutional questions about who is in charge and who is making decisions. So, for example, later in his presidency, Ronald Reagan did invoke the 25th to temporarily hand authority to George H.W. Bush when he was undergoing a surgical procedure. The second piece is much more serious, and that is when the cabinet and the vice president or a committee in Congress determines that the president is no longer capable of handling the duties and the responsibilities of the office. Now, what that means is fuzzy because it's not clearly articulated in the Constitution, because whether it's the framers of the Constitution or congressmen today, when they're writing a bill, they're very reluctant to write out a limited list with the recognition that they can't possibly foresee everything that might come down the pike. And so it doesn't really say what it means for the president to be incapable, because they wanted that to be a little bit flexible for the future. It has not been invoked. There have been discussions about it. The most recent occurrence was the cabinet apparently did discuss invoking the 25th after January 6th, 2021, but they did not. And so this is all very much untested waters.
Yeah, it doesn't say senility. It doesn't say dementia. One would hope that if a president starts to suffer dementia, which is different than senility, that the people around him would say, okay, we have to make a change here. James Garfield, to go back into history for a moment, was in a coma for 80 days before he died of the wounds from the assassin who shot him. We already mentioned Woodrow Wilson. 18 months, the last 18 months of his term, he was suffering from a stroke. I mean, clearly there, neither person should still have been president. There was no 25th Amendment at the time. This came up during Trump's presidency as well, just based on the idea that he was crazy.
Oh, one quick thing I wanted to note. I don't think Garfield was in a coma. I think he was on the operating table for 90 days, but he was most of the time conscious, which would have been excruciating.
Yeah, thank you for correcting me there. Yeah, that sounds like a long time to be in a coma, 80 days.
And they were like poking him and it would have been horrific.
Oh yeah, about Biden, it's often now said that, well, because he goes up there and he makes gaffes or whatever, that he must be dealing with senility or whatever. Neither you or I is a doctor here, but, nowadays everyone's an armchair medical professional. I just don't see any easy way for the Biden campaign or the Trump campaign to set aside these issues about mental acuity.
there isn't really a way for them to end the conversation, because even if Biden were to do a mental fitness test and were to pass it with flying colors, we know that he has sort of been known as a gaffe machine for his entire career since he was in his 30s. He has a stutter, so it does tend to make him misspeak. And as you and I know, if you're going to do a lot of public speaking, at some point you're going to misspeak regardless of who you are, whether you're, on a podcast or you're the president of the United States. So even if there are those misspoken moments, people are going to use them if they have a partisan agenda to make a certain argument about where he is mentally. I think what's really important in this particular moment is a recognition of the situation that we're in, that we have two candidates that are older. They, of course, are going to get older over the next 4 years. Nothing that can be done about that. They are likely to slow down. And so there needs to be an understanding that regardless of who is in office, whether or not they are 40 years old or 80 years old, the president cannot do everything himself and has to be surrounded by a very capable team. That is even more important this go-round, with the recognition that we are in this relatively unusual situation.
Yeah, the notion that Biden is old and fading. His team has said, well, in private, he handles the issues well, he's prepared, he asks a lot of questions, he's sharp, etc. People don't believe that when they then see him in public looking as old and slow as he is. Another issue here, too, is some people are worried that he may not live out his second term, so they don't want to vote for him. I mean, Nikki Haley made this point when she was running on the Republican side.
Well, first of all, a vote for Joe Biden is a vote for Kamala Harris. You know that, and I know that. There is no way that Joe Biden's going to finish his term. I think Kamala Harris is going to be the next president, and that should send a chill up every American's spine.
As we said earlier, usually elections do not turn on the vice president. Most people are not voting for a vice president, at least not since the 1900s. I guess in the 1800s, it used to be an important geographic consideration, but in the last 100 years, that has really not swayed the ticket in any particular way. But I suspect that it could play more of a role in this upcoming election because both candidates are older. And so perhaps people will be paying more attention to who is standing in the wings.
Yeah, we don't know who Trump's running mate is yet. And we didn't even mention Sarah Palin, who also was criticized like Dan Quayle had been criticized. Too young and just seemingly not ready for prime time. Last question for you, Lindsay, and thank you for traveling with me through all this time here, the last 200 plus years of the presidency. How did we get so many old people in the Senate? Not so much the House, but the Senate. People in their 80s and 90s.
Yeah, so I think there are three reasons that we are currently in this situation. The first is the power of incumbency, especially in the Senate. That's for a couple of reasons. One, Senate elections are very expensive, and it's easier to raise money for a campaign if you are already in office. So there's that additional benefit of being in the incumbent position. Incumbency is also very valuable when a lot of Americans don't pay attention to politics. And when they show up to vote, they vote for the name that they know. And so if you're an incumbent, you're more likely to have higher name recognition. The second piece is that a lot of people who are in power, a lot of the people who are older, they are representing a generation, especially the sort of the older part of the boomer generation, that is still a very powerful force. So they are a huge voting bloc, and they are choosing representatives that speak to that voting bloc. And so I think that this is sort of a system-wide dynamic at the moment, that certain generations are really holding on to power in a way we haven't seen as much before. The third piece is that if we were to consider term limits or that kind of thing, the people who are currently in power who don't seem to want to let go of power would have to be the people to pass those rules. And it doesn't seem like they're very incentivized to do so. So we're kind of in a chicken and egg situation here.
Lindsay Chervinsky, we look forward to your book coming out in September about the John Adams presidency. On upcoming episodes of History as It Happens, we're going to take a look at the election of 1992, our monthly series about important elections in American history. Next up, 92, Bush versus Clinton versus Perot. And if you want to make sure you're staying up to date on what's coming up, sign up for my newsletter, historyasithappens.com, or just go to Substack and search for History as It Happens. This is a podcast from the Washington Times.